Hey everyone. Okay, here is the video lecture for this week. And the topic of this lecture is going to be essentially the kind of crises of the first half of the 20th century. The real point is to try to communicate to you, or to try to give you a little bit of an overview of what these crises were when they happened, in order to help contextualize the reading that you're going to do in Roger Daniels' book for this week, and help you see how those things kind of affected U.S. immigration specifically. So the real point of this lecture is to kind of contextualize things for you. But I'm also going to kind of push a narrative, or I'm going to push sort of two arguments in all of this. The first argument is really that essentially the world wars and the Mexican Revolution and the sort of crises that I'm going to talk about affected a dramatic change in the way that immigration happened in the U.S., specifically where the bulk of immigration started to come from. It's during this period that we start to see a shift of migration from sort of the old world, from Europe, right, being the bulk of immigrants coming into the United States, to migration from the New World, specifically from Central America and the Caribbean. So the best example that we'll look at in this lecture is the example of Mexicans and immigration from Mexico and how it sort of demonstrates this transition. The second thing is that this lecture will sort of plant the seed for some things you're going to see in the coming weeks, which is a shift in the way that immigration is handled and the types of immigration that happen in the United States and the way that it's sort of handled. And specifically what we see come out of this period of crisis is the birth of a new concept of a new type of immigrant, the refugee. And eventually, I'll talk about this in future weeks, that concept gets legal definition, right? It becomes a sort of legal status. It gets woven into immigration laws, and refugee migration becomes a thing in and of itself. But it's all sort of born from these crises. So I want to talk about these crises very quickly, in order to give you an awareness of why all of this change happens during this period and in the decades that follow. Okay, so before I get into the crises specifically, I want to talk a little bit about context because I think it helps explain some of these long-term effects of all of this. Remember that the beginning, the sort of turn of to the 20th century is a period of really of nativism, of exclusion, and of immigration restriction in the United States, right? The Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 really starts this movement, but then there are lots of laws that are passed after this that kind of restrict who can come to the United States. The 1917 Immigration Act, if you remember, is one of these things that stipulates what kinds of measures need to be put into place, right? So like visas, initiates the requirement of visas to come into the country. As well as excluding certain types of people with diseases and people with mental instability and things like that, right? Or we're sort of excluded and barred from entry. And then finally, in 1924, we get probably the most important immigration legislation that we see during this period, the Immigration Act of 1924, which sets up the quota system that says essentially, that sets a limit on the amount of people that can migrate to the United States from each country of the world, right? And the quota system was based on, if you remember, right, the 1890 census, and it was based on the type of people that were already here at that time. And most of the countries that sort of got quotas were European countries, right? So it was a certain amount of people from places like England and Germany and France and Russia, Eastern Europe, things like that, right? And this is really important because remember at this time, right, Chinese exclusion was still in place, right? So there was no quota for people from China. But also, probably most importantly, there was no quota for people or for countries in the New World, in the Western Hemisphere. Because at that time, the amount of migration that had come in, the amount of immigration that had happened from that part of the world was pretty negligible, right? It didn't compare to the amount of people coming from Europe. So that context is really important to remember when we think about the way that immigration happened during this period. The other piece of context is that this is also a period of dramatic U.S. Economic and industrial expansion, right? This is the classic Gilded Age in which the U.S. economy expanded tremendously, right? And the United States became an industrial powerhouse in the world. This process is only going to be furthered by these crises, and we're going to see that it's going to have dramatic effects, right? The economics undergirds a lot of a lot of the changes that happened to immigration during this period. Okay, so now to the crises. So there are really kind of four major crises that I want to cover that affected immigration during this period. The first is the Mexican Revolution. So the Mexican Revolution takes place from 1910 to 1920, but it has its roots really in the period before that, in the period of the essentially the dictatorship of a guy named Porfirio Diaz. Porfirio Diaz was essentially the leader of Mexico from 1876 to 1910. And while there were elections and presidential elections, he was technically the president, he essentially had a lock on power for that entire period. And why this is significant is because Diaz's government was one that didn't have a lot of access to like democratic institutions for a lot of the people in Mexico. And also, Diaz welcomed U.S. investment in Mexico, including U.S. investors purchasing of land, purchasing of rights for things like mining and contracts to construct railroads and utilities and all sorts of things. To the effect that U.S. investors actually invested something in the ballpark of about $1 billion in Mexico during this period, during the period of Diaz's presidency. Why this was a problem is that with foreign investment, this meant that the Mexican citizens' ownership of land and resources and companies and properties, right, were dramatically limited. And at the end of his presidency, right? So in the beginning years of the 20th century, there grew a sort of grassroots protest over these kinds of the lack of access that Mexican citizens had to not only political rights but also sort of economic opportunities. And it kind of culminated in this movement led by this guy Francisco Madero in 1909, who sort of went to run against Diaz in the presidential election and was eventually jailed. And then he called for a revolution, and that sort of sparked this revolution that began really in 1910 and led to Diaz being forced out of Mexico and a whole sort of political crisis after the fact in which a political vacuum was formed and all sorts of groups tried to get involved and tried to seize power. The result of all of this is 10 years of fighting. It was incredibly devastating to the Mexican economy, but also to the Mexican people, right? Thousands upon thousands of people were killed in this. But also what it did is, because it was so destructive, right, it also forced migration. It pushed a lot of Mexican citizens to migrate. And the easiest place for them to migrate, of course, was the United States. So beginning in 1910 and for the following sort of decade, we see an increase, a sort of expansion of Mexican immigration to the United States. In fact, from 1910 to 1930, over 1 million Mexican citizens migrated to the United States, right? It was a huge, huge migration. It's about 10% of the entire Mexican population at that time. So the first crisis that we can look at, right, is the Mexican Revolution. We can see that the devastation of the war and the sort of political chaos that resulted from it pushed people out of Mexico into the United States. The second thing we can look at is the crisis around World War I. So World War I was happening basically meanwhile at the same exact time that the Mexican Revolution was happening. In 1914, the assassination of the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, Franz Ferdinand, essentially set off a whole kind of chain of events that led to most of the countries of Europe declaring war against each other. And that actually resulted not only in just war in Europe, but it resulted in war in all of the European empires, which spanned the entire globe. So World War I, we call this World War I because the war touched essentially the entire globe. It was fought all over the world. And millions of people were deployed in this war, right? Fought in this war. People from Europe, people from Asia, people from Africa, all sorts of people, millions of people around the world fought in this war. That's one of the reasons that it was so devastating, right? It was just the scale of the war. But also, World War I was one of the first wars in which all combatants were essentially coming from industrialized countries. So this is the first kind of major industrial war. And that meant that the military technology was more powerful than ever, and thus the war was more destructive than ever. The economic fallout of the war absolutely devastated the economies of Europe. The total cost of the war by people sort of measuring it at the time was something in the ballpark of $338 billion. And that's dollars, we're talking dollars in like 1914 dollars, which is an incredible amount of money. It was 6 times the national debt of every single country in the world combined, just to put that into context, right? So World War I sort of starts this really devastating cycle in which European industrial nations start to go through an economic decline. The result of that actually was that the United States started to actually increase its economic ascendance. The U.S. became the single largest industrial producer because of the war. By 1929, the U.S. was producing 42% of all of the world's goods. Right? Almost half of all of the world's products were being produced in the United States at that time. And the U.S. economy grew, right? The Dow Jones rose from 63 points in 1921 all the way to 381 points by September 1929. That's a 600% increase. This is essentially the reason for the period that we know of as the Roaring Twenties, right? When the United States was economically the most sort of productive it's ever been in some ways, right? That all ended, however, in the kind of third moment of crisis with the Great Depression. When the stock market crashed in October of 1929, right, the Dow declined by 89% over the next few years, and we start to see all sorts of economic trials and tribulations in the United States in which that sort of growth stopped, and we see an economic decline. Everything from bank failures, which increased markedly in the early years of the 1930s, to unemployment, which also spiked during this time, to just per capita wealth, right? The amount of money that most people had plummeted all during this time. And the effect of this, right, is that it actually impacted the way that people migrated into and out of the country. And I'll show you this in just a second. The Depression was sort of ended by the final crisis, World War II. When World War II started in 1939, and when the U.S. got involved in 1941, one of the effects actually was that the U.S. economy started to recover, right? Because the U.S. started producing not only military equipment, but all sorts of resources for all of its allies, right? But the consequence of this, and the consequence of World War II, is that World War II was even more destructive of a war than World War I was, right? Tens of millions of people died in this war, and not just soldiers, civilians too. If you remember, right, from high school history classes, World War II also saw the bombing of cities, like the Battle over Britain, right, and the bombing of London, and the firebombing of Dresden and places like that, right, so that civilian populations were targeted. This is the period of the atomic bomb, right, when the atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, right, and tens of thousands of people were killed in that. And then also this is the period of the Holocaust, in which certain parts of the civilian population were targeted specifically, and a sort of genocidal execution of large scales of the population was enacted, right? Tens of millions of people died because of World War II. And the effects were absolutely catastrophic. So what's the result of all of this? First, all of these crises shaped immigration in some really important ways. And the best way to look at that is to look at immigration of people from Mexico during this period. And if you look at this chart, what you'll see, right, is that immigration from Mexico really increased. It started to increase at the period when the Mexican Revolution started, right? Right around 1910 or so, we start to see large amounts of Mexicans coming to the country. But then there's a change that happens, right? That immigration increases all the way through the 1920s because of the power of the U.S. economy, but then there's a change in the 1930s in which it plummets. And this is the Great Depression, right? This is the effect of the Great Depression, where there's actually a net loss in migration. Mexicans actually re-migrate back to Mexico instead of coming into the United States. But then, come World War II, we see migration come back up, right? Because the economic opportunities in the United States started to be revived by the war. The last thing I'll say is this, the other effect is this, because all these wars were so devastating, one of the concerns that lawmakers started to take into account from this period going on was the concern of people that they deemed refugees, vulnerable populations that were vulnerable because of war, because of genocide, because of political oppression, things like that. In the years after the war, we start to see measures taken place to welcome refugees into the United States as immigrants. So we'll talk more about that in the weeks to come, but I want to kind of bring you to that right now. All right, good job, good luck.